Hello and welcome to my channel. This is Mrs. Happy Catholic and my guest, Andrew. He is my friend from the East Coast. We've done a video together before about his story growing up in traditionalism and then entering into, the full experience of Catholicism. That's called Catholicism Beyond Traditionalism.
Beyond Traditionalism, right. Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. And I can link that in the description below so you can go watch that because it's excellent. And today we're talking about an article that Andrew wrote recently about the state of necessity declared by the SSPX and other traditionalist groups to justify their ministry outside of the normal bounds of the church. And it was just such a comprehensive article and very engaging. Like, I read the whole thing through. It's a little bit long, but it was totally worth it because it was just answered point by point, like any objection that I could have conceived of to the argument. And it was just very logical, like totally not emotional, just logical and full of great quotes from church tradition and magisterium and saints. And so anyway, I just really encourage you to read that. That link will also be in the description below to the article if you want to read it, or you have friends that don't like videos and they want to read it for themselves. So anyway, but welcome, Andrew, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be back. It's been a little while, so I'm glad to be on your show again.
Cool. Yeah, we're excited. Okay, so tell us about this article that you wrote.
Yeah. So, I was sort of piecing together some of the main defenses that this is titled for the SSPX, but this kind of applies to all independent traditionalist groups. And I started going through their position, kind of examining it from the position of what if they're actually right. I was like, that's a tactic that I've not really seen people use, of like, okay, if they're right, what does that imply? What does that mean? And a lot of people get really hung up on taking their points and trying to disprove them kind of point by point or canon by canon, and showing how maybe the foundations are not great. But I thought, what if we actually acknowledge that they're correct and try to come up with a situation or a solution from there? And like you said, this is really more of just a logic exercise. This is not, I mean, I'm just some dude. I don't have I try to study church documents and church fathers and such as much as I can, but I have as much authority as the next guy, which is to say none. So this is really just kind of I tried to just take an exercise in logic and figure out, okay, if they're correct, what does that mean? What does that imply? And does that work? And the objective with the article was to, kind of try to show it really doesn't. So my premise here is not with starting with the idea that they're wrong and then trying to prove why. It's more, okay, if they're right, what does that mean? And let's go through that. So cool. Let me pull it up here, and I'll just kind of go down point by point. We'll talk about their two main things. So there's the state of necessity, which they cite, and then which naturally leads into their supply jurisdiction that they talk about. So there's this quote from the Pontifical Council for the Interpretation of Legislative Texts. I know it's a mouthful, but back in 1996. So they issued a statement on the SSPX situation. And they said, as far as the state of necessity in which Monsignor Lefebvre thought to find himself, one must keep before one that such a state must be verified objectively, and there is never a necessity to ordain bishops contrary to the will of the Roman pontiff, head of the College of Bishops. So they make it very clear, right from the get-go, it must be verified objectively. So a state of necessity is not this broad, all-encompassing thing that you can cite when it's, when your situation is inconvenient. It has to be verified objectively. And that's why if you read in canon law and all the examples that are usually cited, state of necessity almost always means like danger of death. Or if there's a true objective, if somebody is dying on the side of the road, anybody can look at them and say, yes, they're bleeding out, they need sacraments. I mean, obviously in that situation, there is a state of necessity, right? But this citation or this statement got me thinking, what's the objective? How can we verify objectively the state of necessity that they cite for their ministry today? Because they just follow Lefebvre's example, and they say the state of necessity allows us to operate as we do. Okay, so how do we objectively verify that? And that's kind of what I'm going to be doing here. Is it's just kind of a bunch of rhetorical questions. I don't know that I'm going to be posing any kind of conclusions for you, but for viewers and I hope that SSPX and traditionalist people watch this, and because I'm genuinely trying to figure out the answer, I've not been able to, and this is just kind of some propositions or some questions for them that maybe we'll get people to think a little bit.
Yeah.
So
Awesome.
so okay, let's go through a couple, and we'll try to figure out where this lands. So let's say, is it the Mass? Is it the Novus Ordo? Is that what's causing the state of necessity? And then once we get rid of the Novus Ordo, then the state of necessity is over. That seems pretty clearly that that's not accurate, because as we all know, the SSPX and independent traditionalists like Sedevacantists discourage or outright forbid their followers from going to any other Latin masses, the Fraternity, the Institute, diocesan Latin masses. They still say you can't go anywhere else. So it's not a matter of the Mass, because it's clearly something deeper than that. I added a note in here as well that you hear this opinion or this position a lot from the hardcore traditionalists, where the Latin Mass, the 1962 Missal, is this like bulwark against heresy. It protects against error. I think there was there was I think it's from the opening of the quote unquote Ottaviani intervention, where he says something to that effect of it protects against error or something. And I think we should remember, what Mass were they saying when Martin Luther caused his shenanigans? What Mass were they saying when Jansenism popped up? What Mass were they saying when Gallicanism was a thing? What Mass were the old Catholics, and do they still say? For goodness sakes, late 19th, early 20th century, when modernism was identified and condemned, and everyone was losing their minds because it was becoming so bad. What Mass are they saying? The Latin Mass. It's not this, it's not this this like pinnacle of orthodoxy.
It's not a guarantee.
Where,
right.
Yeah, it's about your disposition. You can't rely on a set of rubrics or a certain ritual to somehow like protect you against that's just, it doesn't make any sense.
You did a forum post on tradrecovery.com recently about the lex orandi, lex credendi phrase, which we probably mentioned before in other videos, is actually a term that was first used by the modernists. It's not a Catholic term. It's not any kind of official judgment.
Right. So this is from, I'll actually read it off. I just pulled it up here. This is from Mediator Dei, Pius XII. Yeah. So he said, we judge it our duty to rectify an attitude with which you are doubtless familiar. We refer to the error and fallacious reasoning of those who have claimed that the sacred liturgy is a kind of proving ground for the truths to be held of faith, meaning by this that the Church is obliged to declare such a doctrine sound when it is found to have produced fruits of piety and sanctity through the sacred rites of the liturgy, and to reject it otherwise. Hence the epigram lex orandi, lex credendi, the law for prayer is a law for faith. But this is not what the Church teaches and enjoins. That's what Pius XII said. Lex orandi, lex credendi is not what the Church teaches and enjoins. People need to know that. That idea has been condemned by the See of Rome. That's one of the big, again, you find these slogans or these taglines that are thrown out a lot, but once you start doing some digging and you figure out where they came from and what the Church actually says, Pius XII said, no, lex orandi does not lex credendi.
Gosh, it's so important to know. So I'm glad you read that. Thank you for looking that up.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So back on your track. I just think it's such a great point about the Mass of St. Pius V. It was not given any kind of divine guarantee that by the time in history that Mass had been codified and developed, it was perfect forever. It would, never, allow in any error or problems in the Church later. Like, it's like people talk about like it's a confirmation in grace. It's like, no, you're going to still struggle and you're going to still make mistakes. Like, that's never a guarantee.
Right. There isn't some objective, measurable like quantity of grace or piety attached to a certain set of rubrics. If you don't have the right disposition to receive the grace from those, they won't do anything for you. So, yeah, I think that's very important to know. And kind of on that same track on the Mass of Pius V. So this is a passage from the Pope, the Council, and the Mass, that book. They say, the Mass of St. Pius V, with all its admirable features, which Paul VI and others have often remarked on, was no barrier to the doctrinal deviations that have been the true cause of the decline of Catholic faith and practice of the Church in the early 20th century. The root causes for the present crisis of faith and crisis of authority, crises which affect both church and society, lie far deeper than which Mass is being celebrated, and it would be a profound mistake to think otherwise. I think that's very good. It's not the Mass that's being said. If the Mass were this, bulwark against heresy, we wouldn't have any of the major heresies of the last several hundred years. I think that's a pretty weak argument. And we kind of touched on it already, but yeah, all these things, all these entertainments, all these distractions of our world today, do we think that they wouldn't affect people as long as they're attending the Latin Mass? I mean, I'm not going to delve into criticism or anything here, but you know, I grew up in those circles, as I've told in my other video, and these things affect people in traditionalist circles just as much. It's not like you're in a little bubble where nothing can get in. I think we would have the same issues of low Mass attendance and unbelief in the real presence and all these things. I think those would still be with us today if nothing had ever changed. I don't think we can rely on those old forms.
Right.
Yeah. So,
well, I remember you telling me about when you were in college and you were meeting some more Novus Ordo kids in college and how happy and at peace they seemed and like sincere in their faith. And then, but you were also going to college with a bunch of people from St. Mary's area, and they were like, you know, drinking, partying on the weekend. They're like, well, it's fine. We'll just go to confession and get to Mass on Sunday morning, but it's only going to be the Latin Mass because that's the only right one. But you were like, wow, you guys are like really living two sides of the coin here. It just was very obvious that they were not walking the walk any day except Sunday necessarily.
Yep. It will, act like everybody else, but we got to drive back to St. Mary's for Latin Mass on Sunday.
Man,
it doesn't follow. It's inconsistent.
Right.
So we've established, okay, it's not the Mass that's causing the crisis. So we'll dig a little deeper, beyond the Mass. Is it the Council? Is it Vatican II? Allegedly, Bishop Fillet is on record saying that 95% of the content of the documents of Vatican II is just fine, and it's just a couple problematic phrases or words or whatever, right? Okay, so we don't need to erase everything. We don't need to completely strike it from the historical record. Do we just need to take out those, the subsistit or the the whatever problematic terms of phrase are used in there? I think, again, the answer is very clearly no. Most Catholics, I think this should be rectified, but most Catholics haven't read the documents of Vatican II. Most Catholics probably don't care to. And to think that, this crisis of faith will just go away if you just kind of edit a couple of documents that are in the Vatican archives, again, it seems pretty easy to deduce that that's not going to cause people to increase their faith here. So then is it when the sacraments are reverted back to the old form? Is it when we go back to like the old, baptismal rites and ordination rites and all these things? You find some inconsistency among traditionalist circles as to whether ordinations in the new rite are valid or not. I think the SSPX officially teaches that they are, and it would seem that that's consistent because they say the Novus Ordo is a valid Mass. So, do we just need to go back and erase any doubt about whether or not these are legit? Again, that doesn't seem to work because you've got groups like the Fraternity and the Institute who are ordained in the old rite. They celebrate the sacraments in the old rites. They do all these things. They're basically SSPX, but with like the rubber stamp of approval. So clearly it's not like the sacraments or anything like that. It's not the actual things that are done.
Right.
And that leads to,
he would say that it was the intention, like that if the intention of the celebrating cleric is affected by modernism or whatever disbelief or incorrect belief, that would invalidate his ability to like consecrate the Eucharist effectively. So, which actually is contrary to church teaching, but that was his understanding that he promoted. And so it's ideological, right? We're talking about case by case. You'd have to like open the mind of every priest or bishop to be like, what do you think about the Catholic faith and all these different points? And are you really in line? Because if you're not, then your sacraments aren't going to work. And if you are, then they are. But then again, but the church doesn't even teach that is necessary in order for them to confect valid and illicit sacraments. So we're wandering into territory that doesn't even need to be charted.
Right. Right, exactly. It's a matter of if the priest is there and says the words, that is enough intention to confect the sacrament. That is church teaching. And so that, that argument seems to fall apart. And speaking of the fraternity and the institute and all these other traditionalist groups, so as we all know, the SSPX still operates when there's a fraternity church like down the road. I mean, I grew up in, the St. Mary's Maple Hill area, right? So
Right.
you're still claiming the state of necessity that allows you to operate even when there's a parish down the road that offers the same sacraments that you do under the same forms that you do. And I'll add a note here at the beginning, and I get into this article later, but on their website, they have this whole long canonical study about their supply jurisdiction and the state of necessity and all these things. And Father Ramon Angles, who wrote this whole thing and gets into some very deep canonical weeds that just made my head spin. But I mean, as he says, if the priests of the Society of St. Pius X do not have jurisdiction, it appears that the confessions they hear and the marriages they bless are invalid. If they have no faculties, all the priestly work they perform every day is illegitimate and therefore evil. And if this is so, it would be a sin to receive their services, maybe even to ask for them. So this is a big deal. This is a big deal. This is not something to trifle with. Again, I'm not drawing a conclusion as to whether they are or not here. I'm just saying, for those who are in that world, this is a really big deal. This is a matter of valid and or licit sacraments. That's not something that you mess around with, right? So if and since they acknowledge they don't have an ordinary canonical mission, they aren't authorized by the local bishop, the only thing that's allowing them to operate and to do what they do is this state of necessity. Okay, so if the state of necessity is still present when you're down the street most of the time from a fraternity chapel or an institute chapel, it seems like it has nothing to do with the sacraments or the mass or anything like that. It has to do with the ideology, the agreement or the what's the word I'm looking for? Just kind of the acceptance of Vatican II and of the post-conciliar church, quote unquote. So, which is confusing because, so when we think about it, he has this whole thing in his study about how, we have to do this so that the faithful don't have to approach a modernist priest or a modernist cleric for their sacraments. So let's think about like a wedding, for instance, or a marriage. The priest doesn't have to do anything. He has to stand there and just listen to you exchange your vows. He doesn't have to do your wedding mass. He doesn't have to do your marriage prep. He doesn't have to give a homily. He doesn't have to do any of these things. The only thing that's required is that you are the ministers of the sacrament. The priest is not. The priest is not administering marriage onto you. You are doing it with each other in front of a delegated witness of the church. So if he doesn't have to do anything except stand there and then sign a paper, what risk are you running by approaching even your local diocesan priest? How's he going to endanger your soul? Or how's he going to, how is this a danger to you? Why is it that you need to approach a priest who is not delegated by the church to do it, when the priest who is delegated is right down the street? You acknowledge that he's a validly ordained priest, and he doesn't have to even say a word the whole time. Even in confession, he doesn't necessarily have to give you spiritual advice. You just walk in and say your sins, he absolves you. What danger are you putting yourself in that would necessitate you going to a priest who's not authorized to do that? Like, it's inconsistent. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Accepting the propositions of a council don't have any effect on whether or not you can validly or licitly confer the sacraments. So this doesn't make any sense. And all that is to say, it's funny to say that these questions are all a waste of time, but they kind of are, because even if you can narrow down what it is that is determining the state of necessity, what's the objectively verifiable thing that's determining the state of necessity, who's determining that? It's the SSPX determining it. It's not the church. So they're putting their own judgment and their own authority above the authority of the church. They're deferring to their own judgment. And as I said, the problem with this is that they would have to acknowledge that once a certain thing, some objectively verifiable thing, which we haven't identified yet, but even if they identify it, once that thing is done or is resolved, they don't have supply jurisdiction anymore, which means they have to immediately cease and desist. Otherwise, as Father Angles says, their work is illegitimate and therefore evil. If they don't have justification for doing these things, then yeah, that's the result. So again, it would necessitate an immediate cease and desist. Otherwise, they would be subject to canonical penalties. It's kind of the same situation that Sedevacantists face, where if there's no pope, when and how do we get a legitimate pope? And not only that, who determines how and when we get a legitimate pope? And if you can come up with an answer, what makes your opinion any more authoritative than the next set of Sedevacantist groups? Who has authority here?
Right. Like, can you all even agree on the same thing, the same set of principles? I mean, look at the Orthodox bishops. They can't even get together and like have a council. Like, they've tried, but it's like they can't all agree on something. They haven't been able to pronounce any teaching or developments of things, because they're all kind of in their own little kingdom. And it's like, well, we sort of agree that we're not going to be under Rome, but we don't agree in every other point. So we're just going to kind of keep our distance. I mean, Isn't that what we're looking at here in the traditionalist movement as it expands and these bishops start running around?
Yeah, it's kind of all just a link, an agreement of negatives of sorts, where we say we all agree that we don't like this thing, but we all can't agree on the things that we really need to agree on. So it presents a very the title of the article is The Subjective Nature of the SSPX's Ministry. It's a very subjective situation where it's up to each individual person. There's no fixed authority here.
Right.
And not only do we not know when and how the state of necessity is over, my other question that I pose is, what happens if SSPX leadership can't agree on that? As we just kind of discussed with the Orthodox, what if Bishop Fillet thinks that the state of necessity is over, but Bishop de Galarreta doesn't? How do you determine who's right? None of the three bishops have any more authority than the other. They're all kind of on the same level here. So if one thinks the state of necessity is over and the other one doesn't, he can just say, well, no, it's not, and I'm going to keep ministering. And there's really no reason why he couldn't, because his brother bishop's opinion that the state of necessity is over doesn't bind him, because he's not in any more position of authority than him. So you would run into this weird situation where you've got one bishop saying, no, we have to stop. I can't do this anymore. We're done. State of necessity is over. And then you have another bishop saying, no, it's not. I'm going to keep going. And there's really no reason why he wouldn't be able to do that based on their logic.
Right.
So this doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Not only that, objection number 3, even if they did decide on let's say they as a group, they collectively decided that they figure out what it is that's causing the state of necessity, disregarding the fact that a consensus would make it even more subjective. This doesn't work. But even if they're able to figure out what it is that's causing the state of necessity, and they declare, okay, it's this, and once this is gone, then then we can't. What's to say they can't just change their mind about it? Because it's their own judgment, it's their own declaration. They'd be submitting to their own kind of subjective conclusions of the scenario, not any authoritative judgment from above. So if their terms were to be met, if they said, here's what it is, and once that's done, then the state of necessity is over, and then that thing is done, all they have to do is say, that's not good enough. And then they could just keep operating. And again, there's really no reason why they couldn't. I mean, I work in contracts at work, and if you lay out a contract and you sign it and you're doing the work and things aren't quite going according to plan, you just draw up an amendment and you sign the amendment, and the original contract is no more binding than the amendment is. It doesn't matter that it was done first, or that there's no reason why they couldn't just change their mind, and then they would by their own conclusions be able to keep operating. There's no answer here. If you ask someone, when is the state of necessity over, and who determines that and how, there's no answer. And when the state of necessity is what's giving them kind of carte blanche permission to just do whatever they want, wherever they want. And if it's up to them to determine when it is over, I don't think they're ever going to give you an answer, because that would mean relinquishing all their property, all their ministry, all their, all these things. In 1976, Pope Paul VI told Lefebvre that reconciliation with the church, coming back into full communion with the church, would mean that he would need to hand over all his chapels and seminaries and all these things, and each individual, it'd be kind of a case-by-case basis, where wherever they unlawfully set up this thing in whichever diocese, it would be up to the bishop of that diocese to say, yes, you can continue to operate, or no, we're going to shut you down. You're putting it in the hands of the lawful church authorities here. So to acknowledge that the state of necessity is over means handing over everything. And I just don't see that ever happening.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. I mean, they've been on their own track for so long. And yeah, now they have all this money and these buildings and this following and this power and control. That would be really hard to come back from. You would have to be, this is the test of their sincerity. If they actually are working towards reunion with the church, or if they could actually articulate, this is when it could definitely end. And it's just not a clear-cut issue. Like you're saying, it's basically up to everybody's individual interpretation, and that's what they're doing. But they're united in their disagreements about certain things, and so that's what keeps them away in their own little world. And until that can be resolved, they won't be even in a position to be able to have reunion with the church. So can they even sort it out among themselves, or are they just going to keep splintering? So far, the precedent they've set is a splintering precedent. And if you talk to people that go to traditionalist communities, they're all in a little slightly different place with things than the other people in the community. It's like Protestants. They all have a little bit of their own variety of doctrine and understanding things. Well, I believe that, but I'm not so sure about this, or it's very subjective and it's kind of chaotic. And it's like, wow, I didn't think that's what being Catholic was supposed to look like. I thought we were supposed to be united and all on the same page. And that's how we move forward. But you can't do that if you can't get everybody together to even figure out if we all agree. And yeah, it's like, what are we agreeing with? Just some precedent that we try to establish for ourselves, or an eternal divine precedent that Christ established for the church? There's a lot more security in that than the former. Right.
As soon as you withdraw obedience, you become your own authority. And then it's ultimately up to you, not the divinely established authority, right? I've posed this question to people before, and usually it's when the Latin Mass is reinstated. And it's like, well, no, it's not, because as we just demonstrated, that doesn't work. You get varying answers. I've gotten things like, it's when we return to tradition, when we clean out the modernism and we return to tradition. Okay. How do you do that? What does that mean? What does that entail? Does that entail, defrocking certain priests or bishops? Does it entail getting rid of, theology manuals? And again, who determines that? There's no, it's not the church determining these things. It's you. It's the groups. It's the ideologies, right? So. So that's the question that I would, for those of you who are watching, who support the SSPX, or who have friends or family who are in it, that's the question that I would, my number one question of this podcast is, when is the state of necessity over? When is the crisis over? And who determines that, and how? Because once it is, these independent traditionalist groups who rely on the state of necessity for their jurisdiction no longer have jurisdiction, and they have to stop. And so who determines how that happens, and what is that? There's no answer. It's so subjective. It's so dependent on each individual person, group. You've got traditionalist groups out here that are just, one bishop and 6 priests, in the middle of some random state somewhere. Why would the SSPX determining what the state of necessity is, why would that bind them at all? If they're all making their own individual conclusions and decisions, why would the SSPX's determination bind the CMRI, for example? doesn't work.
Yeah.
So that's ultimately the problem, is that it's too subjective and there's no answer. So I would really seriously, like in the comments or whatever, people who are watching, please, I welcome answers to these questions, because I'm here to pose the questions and to try to figure it out, because it doesn't seem that there's any clear-cut answer here. So that's my first proposition. The next one, and kind of one that we've talked about already, but the supply jurisdiction that comes from the state of necessity, right? And so I've been recently working on a piece about the crisis and the historical nature of it, the cultural nature of it, and not the ecclesiastical, supposed ecclesiastical nature of it. So there's a Dave Armstrong, an apologist, has in one of his books, he says, there are a host of causes for the present crisis in the church, going back to Protestantism, the Enlightenment, materialistic evolutionism, the utopian ideal of progress, massive secularization, Marxism, philosophical relativism, on and on and on. Not to mention that in the 20th century, we've got 2 world wars, we've got the Industrial Revolution, we've got all these, advancements in technology. Like, I don't think we should understate how massive and how influential, for better or for worse, the 20th century was. I think when we're looking at the cause of the crisis here, we need to also take into account the cultural factors and the societal factors. I mean, Father Yves Congar said, he said, I still maintain that the principal cause of the present crisis lies in the impact which the questions, struggles, and changes that affect world society have had on the people of God. I think the crisis is much more cultural and historical than it is ecclesiastical. The SSPX often points at low mass attendance, poor catechesis, all these things, as saying, look, we're in a crisis because people aren't practicing their faith or don't know their faith. And it's like, yes, I agree, like, fair enough. But again, when's it over? How do you determine when it's over? Is it, do you rely on these polls that are going out about how many, the percentage of Catholics who believe in the real presence? Is it when a certain percentage believe in the real presence again? Is it when we get more vocations that exceed what we had before the council? Like, this is not how we measure things in the church. It's not a matter of hard numbers and statistics. Like, that's silly. We can't just look past all these massive societal changes of the last, 150, 200 years and just disregard those and say, oh, the crisis is because of the new missal or because of a council or whatever the case might be, right? That doesn't make any sense. Right. So, if there's this state of emergency that we haven't been able to pin down what it is or how it's defined, and it's bringing this supply jurisdiction, we can't tell what's defining that supply jurisdiction. So my question that I kind of got myself down a mental rabbit hole here, and I said, okay, this really needs to be fleshed out, because there's definitely no answer for this one. If the whole world, if the whole church is in such this dire state of necessity that priests can offer sacraments wherever and whenever they want, right? Why can't any priest do that? Why can't a diocesan priest or a fraternity priest operate under supply jurisdiction if he so chose? I mean, there's a state of necessity, right? Don't people need him? Don't people need sacraments from him? Because it certainly, I mean, it seems like the SSPX supports this idea, because in this article from Father Angles talking about their supply jurisdiction, he says, if a priest without jurisdiction to hear confessions sits in a confessional or puts on a purple stole indicating he is ready to hear confessions, the church will supply his lack of jurisdiction for every absolution he will give. He's saying if a priest without jurisdiction, if he sits in a confessional, then the church will give him jurisdiction.
Well, you better hope that guy's really a priest, because anybody could just put on clericals and sit in a confessional and just be pretending, and you go in there and like, oh, look, there's Joe Priest sitting there. And, I don't know him, but I guess he can give me absolution.
Yeah. Like, this is so, I mean, he says in the article, he says, don't worry, this is sound canonical doctrine. Don't worry. Okay.
Well, if you say so.
If you say so, Father. All right.
Okay.
I'm gonna take a quick a tangent onto this point, because there's a couple of things in this article on their justification for their jurisdiction. So again, for people who support the SSPX who may be watching, or for people who are trying to figure out what it is that's justifying their jurisdiction, this is what they rely on. This is from one of their priests on their website, and he says, this quote is a little bit longer, but it kind of sets the stage for what we need to know here. So he acknowledges, to his credit, he says, the fact that a community ignores that the priest lacks jurisdiction is not a sufficient reason for the church to supply jurisdiction. An error is required on the part of a community whose members actually believe that a priest has jurisdiction, even though he in fact does not have it. This is what we call error of fact, or what you might have heard referred to as common error. So, so there is supply jurisdiction in the case of common error, where, say, you're in and John Salza has a lot of videos on this. He explains a lot better than I can, but the gist of it is basically that if a person at a regular Catholic church goes to confession and some random priest has snuck in there who doesn't have faculties in that diocese, if he has gone in there and this person just thinks, oh, visiting priest, okay, and they say their sins, they get their absolution or whatever, jurisdiction is supplied in that case because it is an error on the part of the recipient. They don't know, and they would have no way of knowing that priest was not delegated by the local bishop. That's how common error works.
Right. But like Saul's has said about the society, and this would apply to other groups like Sedevacantists, who are all operating suspended from their priestly faculties, but they operate anyway. He's like, it's because it's been officially stated that like these clerics are suspended, or that they're in an irregular situation with the church. He's like, it's considered that common error doesn't apply to those groups because it's in the public forum. It's knowledge that's been out there for decades, that it can be discovered easily by any Catholic, and priests should know this too, that it's like those priests don't have faculties. So in that case, common error doesn't apply because it's presumed that people should or easily could know about this. And so it's interesting,
Yeah. So then, yep, exactly. And then, so Father Angles goes on to say, however, it is a common sentence among canonists nowadays that it is sufficient to have an error of law, or called a virtual error, in order to fulfill these conditions. So he says, bear with me here. Bear with me. Error of law consists in a fact whose nature is sufficient to induce the error in a community, even though nobody in the community is mistaken about the lack of jurisdiction in the agent. It is not an actual error, but a fiction of law, or an interpretive error. Listen to this. It is therefore licit for a priest without faculties to create a situation of common error in order to provide the faithful with the sacraments they may not receive otherwise. The mere fact that we administer habitually the sacraments to some community of faithful is sufficient to apply the doctrine of common error. He says, so the public fact is repeatedly presented, which by its nature may induce the faithful to believe that the priest has the faculties to confer sacraments. So he's saying,
so if you deceive people, then it makes your sacraments licit.
Yes, that's what he's saying. You can intentionally deceive people and confuse them into thinking that you have faculties. And if you do that, then you do have faculties, because the people are confused and they don't know. Even if they know that you're not sent by the local bishop, if they're maybe confused because you've sat in that confessional enough times and you've done this enough times, and it's inducing the error in a community, I'm citing him here. If you're deliberately creating confusion in the community, even though they know you're not sent by the local bishop, then that will provide your faculties.
Wow, thanks for taking care of us.
What is this nonsense? What is this nonsense?
Well, and he says if you can't get the sacraments, like for people who can't get the sacraments, I'm like, everybody can get the sacraments unless you're on some desert island somewhere that nobody can reach you. It's like, you can go to the sacraments in an incarnated diocesan parish. They're everywhere, okay? They may not be up to snuff of your preferences, but they're there. And even the society says they're valid sacraments, even though they don't like the form.
Exactly. There's no reason, as we said at the beginning, you can't go down the street to get your absolution or to have your marriage witnessed by a delegated priest of the church. He doesn't have to say anything. He doesn't have to put your faith in danger by giving you some modernist homily. Like, none of that has to happen. All he has to do is stand there and watch you do it, and then sign a paper, and that's it.
That is such a good point. I mean, and it also shows up this trad fear of modernist cooties, okay? Because if you're in the same room with somebody who may not think exactly like you do about something, even if they don't say anything to you, obviously you're in danger.
Yeah.
It's like that bad. It's like, whoa. Your faith must be pretty delicate if it can't take that much exposure.
I know. But I mean, like he says, it is therefore licit for a priest without faculties to create a situation of common error.
Wow.
SSPX people, this is the justification for their jurisdiction. Listen, you don't have to be a canon lawyer to see that's nuts. Like, I'm not gonna get off on my soapbox about this because, oh my gosh.
Oh no! Well, I'm glad you read that and shared it because it's very pertinent and it's very good to know. I mean, okay, all right.
If we just do this enough times so that they're confused, then we have those faculties. What? But again, from their priest on their website. Do with that what you will. I'm gonna leave it right there because
wouldn't be surprised if they take that down after they see this video.
They should have taken that down a long time ago. Probably never should have published it in the first place.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's the justification for their faculties, is that because you can't go to the modernist priest down the street, even though he is perfectly capable of absolving your sins or of witnessing your marriage or of confecting the Eucharist, his ideology that he holds to might somehow kind of creep in and infect you somehow. Even though he offers a valid mass and does all the sacraments validly, you can't go to him for whatever reason. So you have to go to us, who we don't, who haven't been sent by the local bishop. It's such mental gymnastics. It doesn't make any sense. I'm going to actually share something, this thing that I created. I want to show people this because this is, can you see that?
I can see it. I'll add it in here.
Okay. Yeah. This is, this is,
oh my gosh.
This is what it's like. They're trying to just fit like square pegs into round holes, and it doesn't. Anyway, like I said, I'm not a canonist. I'm not an expert on these matters, but surely anybody can read that article and raise an eyebrow because wow. So anyway, so with all that being said, what he's essentially saying is that any priest can appeal to supply jurisdiction wherever and whenever he wanted. That's what he says. If a priest without faculties puts on a purple stole and sits in the confessional, he has the jurisdiction for confession. Any priest. Okay. So
that is such a recipe for chaos. I mean, if that were true, what an admission. I mean, everybody would just be running amok, like doing whatever I want.
Yes, that's anarchy. That is nothing but anarchy. It's wild. So if that is the case, if any priest can legitimately do that, there's no reason for, he can just appeal to supply jurisdiction if he were to get in trouble with his bishop. So if a priest went, diocese hopped and went over to the next diocese and he said, I'm operating under supply jurisdiction. And that bishop said, no, you're not. I didn't authorize you to be here. And he said, no, I can. I have supply jurisdiction. By the SSPX's logic, he would be justified in doing that. And he could legitimately do that. Again, doesn't take a lot of effort to see how that doesn't make sense. So the flip side of this, so on the one hand, if they have their supply jurisdiction that they defend in their article, on the one hand, either that means that every priest in the world has supply jurisdiction, in which case no bishop has any real authority, which we'll get into that later. Or the other situation is that this only applies to the SSPX and to independent traditionalist groups, that only they have supply jurisdiction. Because I imagine if you went to an SSPX priest and you said, excuse me, Father, does the fraternity priest down the road have supply jurisdiction? Could he appeal to that? I'm fairly certain the SSPX priest would probably say no. But then that makes it incumbent on them to explain when and how they are able to appeal to this kind of supply jurisdiction that no other priest can, right? So if a priest is incarnated in a diocese and he decides, I'm done, I want to go join the SSPX, and he leaves his diocese and joins them, when and how did he get the ability to so this is if only the SSPX can invoke supply jurisdiction. That priest, when and how did he get the ability to do that? And when and how did he legitimately lose his delegated jurisdiction from his bishop? Because the SSPX doesn't grant supply jurisdiction. It's not a form that can be granted. It's supplied by the church in case of necessity. They're not granting this jurisdiction, so they're not the one giving it to this priest. Right. So if this jurisdiction is something that only they can claim, this priest clearly at one point didn't have supply jurisdiction, but then when he joined them, he somehow got it, and apparently is no longer subject to the authority of his bishop. What has changed that has changed his form of jurisdiction here? Nothing has changed except his intention, his interior disposition to align himself with the society's ideological stance. And then if he were in the SSPX and he went back to his bishop, when and how would he lose the ability to invoke that supply jurisdiction? Because they say that every priest has it and can invoke it anytime. But if only the SSPX can, when does he lose it? You see, this doesn't work. So we have two possibilities on our hands here in terms of their supply jurisdiction. On the one hand, if any priest in the world can invoke supply jurisdiction, which it certainly seems like they agree with, even if they would say no when you ask them the question, then you have denied the authority of every bishop in the world. You have nullified the apostolic authority of every bishop in the world. No bishop has any actual power over his priest. That priest need only access that like potential for supply jurisdiction that I guess he has to be able to operate anywhere. And by their own logic, he would be able to do that. I mean, at that point, a bishop is just kind of an administrator for a geographic area of a diocese. He doesn't have any actual authority. I mean, it should be pretty easy to acknowledge as Catholics that bishops have authority. You can't dispense with apostolic authority. I mean, Pope Leo XIII wrote in his encyclical Satis Cognitum, he said, "It is not sufficient for the due preservation of the unity of the faith that the head should merely have been charged with the office of superintendent, or that he should have been invested solely with the power of direction, but it is absolutely necessary that he should have received real and sovereign authority, which the whole community is bound to obey." So if every priest in the world can operate under supply jurisdiction, then no bishop in the world has any kind of authority. On the other hand, if only the SSPX can claim, and independent traditionalists can claim this supply jurisdiction, it becomes valid or invalid for priests leaving and joining them somehow. We don't know how. We don't know how and when it is gained and lost. I mean, it seems like in that case, you're making the case that jurisdiction is contingent on your personal intention, where once you join this group that intends to do a certain thing, then that's when your supply jurisdiction kicks in. But again, it doesn't take you don't have to be a canon lawyer to understand that jurisdiction is not some kind of individual power that is contingent on your intention at any given time. Kind of going back to our discussion earlier about sacramental intention, if jurisdiction is based on your intention, how do we know when any SSPX priest has the intention?
Right. What if he stopped believing there was a crisis, but he didn't want to tell anybody, and he just keeps doing his priestly stuff without jurisdiction? Then you're sinning by participating in his sacraments.
Right.
I mean, that could be. How would you know unless before you sat down with any priest to do anything or started mass, you said, you better come out to the pulpit and reassure us that you believe in the state of necessity and that you believe there's a valid reason for you celebrating mass today. And because we got to know, we don't want to be participating in a Eucharist that could be invalid or illicit.
Right. Just as it is not incumbent on us to know our priest's intention to confer the sacraments, we can't try to figure out each time whether or not a priest has the intention for jurisdiction. I mean, you have SSPX priests who have left them before. Clearly, they were probably thinking about it for some time. Clearly, they had doubts for some time. So if only the SSPX can do this, clearly he must have lost his jurisdiction at some point in there when he was deliberating about this. I mean, this is jurisdiction is delegated by a lawful authority like the Pope or the bishop, or it's supplied by the church as circumstances demand it. Right. So if only the SSPX can claim this, were those circumstances not present when this priest was serving in his diocese, but then kind of somehow they are when he joins the SSPX?
Or he didn't need it before he believed in the crisis. He didn't need the supplied jurisdiction because he had ordinary. And then as soon as he believed in the crisis, then he was able to access supplied jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. But it's just so crazy.
Yeah, which he had, the like the potential for, but he just had to access it based on his acquiescence to the existence of this perceived necessity. I mean,
talk about mysticism. This is getting definitely into the weeds here. Like, wow, I don't know about you, but I appreciate there being a visible church with a hierarchy and a teaching office and a pontifical council for the interpretation of legislative texts and all that good stuff. Yeah. It's like, because that's what gives you certainty that God's church is acting as a whole and it's taking care of things. Okay. But if every individual is just up for grabs, it's just crazy. It's like, what are we doing being Catholic or saying that we're Catholic? Like, we're no better off than anybody else. If that's how it is, this is nuts. Exactly. Like, let me off. I'm done.
Wow. I want out of this.
Yeah, right.
I mean, so I have a quote here from Cardinal James Gibbons from 1917. He says, this is a scripture quote to start, but Hebrews 5:4 says, "Neither doth any man take the honor to himself, but he that is called by God, as Aaron was." And then Cardinal Gibbons says, "This text evidently condemns all self-constituted preachers and reformers, for as Romans 10:15 says, how shall they preach unless they be sent? And sent, of course, by legitimate authority and not directed by their own caprice." You have to be authorized. You have to be sent. I mean, so even I'll go off a little bit on this. Jesus himself references being sent by the Father many times. I mean, over 30 times just in the Gospel of John. I mean, John 7:16, he says, "My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me." John 12:44, "He who believes in me believes not in me, but him who sent me." And then to the apostles, he says, "As the Father has sent me, even so I send you." I mean, the word apostle literally means one who is sent, one who is, commissioned.
That's cool.
And Baltimore Catechism, question 1004, the Baltimore Catechism is the favorite among traditionalist circles, says, "Bishops, priests, and other ministers of the church cannot exercise the power they have received in holy orders unless authorized and sent to do so by their lawful superiors." Right. I mean, there is clear historical traditional precedent. You may not universally operate as a minister of the church if you've not been sent by a lawful authority of the church. This is very old traditional teaching,
Yeah.
So
wow.
Anyway, kind of bringing it full circle. So again,
I think that's great. I mean, in Moses, the same thing. Like, God sent him, but he sent him with miracles to prove that he had the divine mission. Okay. And I've heard SSPX priests laugh at that, literally laugh. Oh, and they expect us to perform miracles to justify our mission. Isn't that hilarious? It's like, that's the teaching of the church.
That's
pre-conciliar. Okay. Yep. Like, what you guys are supposed to adhere to, that's not traditional. What you're doing, laughing in the face of the magisterium, I'm sorry, that just shows you for the fakers that you are. And I don't want to be insulting by saying that, but it's like, let us call a spade a spade. If people are deceiving people, especially if they fully understand what they're doing and they do it anyway for whatever reason, for whatever gain, or, even if they have some good intention, like they really think that it's better for everybody to be deceived, then people need to know them for what they are so that they can protect themselves from that, because that influence is not going to lead you to heaven. I mean, this issue about jurisdiction, and it's not some kind of, well, you guys just like to go off on your canon law tangents or whatever. It's like, no, this is about are the sacraments you're going to real sacraments? If they are they approved by the church? Because if they're not, they're sacrilege. And that means if you participate knowingly in a sacrilege, you're not in a state of grace, which means when you die, you ain't going to heaven. So it's a little bit important to know why this is and to understand how it works for you and all your friends.
Yeah, it's not something to be trifled with. I mean, like you said, I've got a couple of citations here. This is Pope Innocent III in Cum Ex Injuncto. He says, therefore, he who says that he is sent by God should not be believed, since he has not been sent by man, unless he personally offers special testimony from Scripture or he shows an obvious miracle. Or, Reverend Sylvester Berry in his book, The Church of Christ from 1927. This is very old, pre-conciliar stuff. If the bishops of the church are not the successors of the apostles, then there are no successors, for no one else has even claimed this distinction. In that case, the power and authority committed to the apostles have lapsed and cannot be renewed except by a direct intervention of Christ in conferring them anew and reestablishing his church. Such an act on the part of Christ would have to be confirmed by the performance of miracles as the only means by which we could be assured of its reality. This is, you can find many quotes.
It's a big deal that God is going to make sure there's no doubt. He will not leave you in confusion and wondering, because he wants you to know how to get to him.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's awesome. I mean, what a great thing that God will send miracles to confirm something in our eyes, to reassure us. And that's how, the saints are canonized. That's part of the process. That's why when trads want to question certain canonizations, because, they made some tweaks to the process since Vatican II or whatever. And it's like, but they still have to have miracles, okay? Miracles which are scientifically confirmed as having no other explanation possible than a supernatural one. And they don't canonize someone without miracles. It's like, well, where in the heck is that coming from? That's, again, God's confirmation of the virtue of this person and that they can be a model for the church. It doesn't mean that everything they ever did was perfect, but it means that they can be there in heaven and people can know that. And then it's good for us to know that. It's better that we know it than that we don't. And otherwise he wouldn't bother sending a miracle.
Right. And, like you said, I would really encourage everyone to go read its section 1, chapter 3 of The Catholic Controversy by St. Francis de Sales. He goes through the entire traditional precedent of the church that if you claim to have extraordinary mission, which is, if you're not sent by the church, if you're not authorized by the church to operate, you must have been sent by God. Because if you're not either of those things, then you're not a legitimate minister. And it was certainly seen that the SSPX thinks that they're sent by God. If you read the letter that Lefebvre wrote to the 4 bishops asking them to become bishops, he says things like, God raised up the priestly society of St. Pius X. He chose himself some true priests. God bestowed upon me the grace to prepare these Levites. I find myself constrained by divine providence. All these things. He very clearly thinks I'm being authorized by God. But St. Francis de Sales says, you must show miracles to prove your mission. Otherwise, we don't know that you're sent by God. If he says an extraordinary mission like this must not be received when disowned by the ordinary authority, which is the Church of our Lord. So if you don't have miracles, if the church has disowned your mission, and if you compete with or overthrow is the word he uses, the ordinary mission, if you set up altar against altar, as he says, if you don't meet any of these 3 criteria, then you don't have a legitimate mission. So that's a big deal. It's not something to mess around with. So I am reaching the end here, but
I hope you include that note about that parentheses you have here on the topic of supply jurisdiction, about that it doesn't only apply to the sacraments, but to other things.
Yes. So just to let everyone know and kind of go back to our reasons for supply jurisdiction. So canonically, the justifications for supply jurisdiction, you have danger of death, seems pretty obvious, common error, or positive and probable doubt. Those are all intentions on the part of people receiving the sacraments. Supply jurisdiction does not / cannot justify things like building churches and seminaries and preaching and granting disciplinary dispensations on your own. Supply jurisdiction doesn't cover those things. That's just straight up disobedience. You can't claim supply jurisdiction to build a church, for example. That's not how that works. So that's something I think people should remember.
Great point.
Yeah. So I would say you've got 2 conclusions you have to admit here. One is either the SSPX and these traditionalist groups are the only ones who can claim supply jurisdiction, or you have every priest can claim supply jurisdiction. In which case, number 1, jurisdiction is contingent on personal intention, which doesn't make any sense. Or on the other hand, if any priest in the world can claim supply jurisdiction, no bishop has any authority anywhere, any real apostolic authority. And if no bishop has any authority, quite frankly, the church doesn't exist. You don't have a church in that case. All the way back to the first century, St. Ignatius of Antioch was saying to obey the bishop and the presbytery with an undivided mind, breaking one and the same bread. And he said, we must not set ourselves in opposition to the bishop in order that we may be subject to God. The church's mark of apostolic is not just a title or a name; it carries authority with it as well. Even our Lord said in John 5:30, he said, "I can do nothing on my own authority. I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me." Again, being sent. So if Jesus himself didn't take on the mission of his Father without being sent by the Father, what should we think of people who assume the church's mission onto themselves and delegate themselves to operate wherever and whenever they like without and against the church authority? I mean, in Father Angles's thing, he says, "Nevertheless, our bishops confirm worldwide, our priests perform all the sacred actions mentioned above, like absolving, preaching, baptizing, without the delegation of the diocesan prelate, and often very much against his will." This is a big deal. So those are the two conclusions that I think you have to respond to. Also, in light of indefectibility, if the church has fallen so corrupt that priests have to minister disregarding the authority of every bishop, then that means that the church has failed to do what she was established to do, which is to sanctify souls, which is to bring souls to heaven. The SSPX apparently thinks that the entire church is compromised, even where other traditional communities have a presence, because they go anywhere they want.
Right.
So if the church has failed in her mission, then the church has defected. Then the church has broken. She has failed. So you'd have to address that conclusion as well. I think they always say the salvation of souls is the highest law, right? We can do what we need to do for the salvation of souls because it's the highest law. They use this very often, but I think it really reveals a chink in their armor here. If your ministry is necessary because the church is not providing for the salvation of souls, then the church is not doing what she was established to do, and she has defected. You're saying we have to provide the salvation of souls because the church is not. So either the church has defected, or if she hasn't, why do you have to do what you do? Your bishops have not been delegated to any diocese. Your priests don't have any ordinary canonical mission. How do you circumvent the church and offer a justification? Again, I'm looking for answers here. I've not been able to come up with an answer. So they've kind of put themselves in this position where the justification for their ministry is completely dependent on subjective opinion and not the decisions of an authoritative magisterium. There's no answer as to the objective criteria that define the state of necessity and supply jurisdiction, when those criteria are no longer present, and who determines that. It's entirely too subjective. So I think I feel like if I were exploring their stance and wondering whether or not I should align myself with them and attend their churches, even if their canonical arguments seem to make sense, or even if I was able to get past certain things, the issue, the subjective issue, the issue of authority, of who's in charge, of who's ultimately calling the shots, that's what I would have a problem with. It's ultimately up to them, and they are the authority in their situation. So to recap for people who are watching, when is the state of necessity over, and when and how does supply jurisdiction work? Because either only the SSPX can claim it, which doesn't make any sense, or every priest in the world can claim it, which also doesn't make any sense. So that just leads me to believe you're starting with a faulty premise.
Yeah.
So that's the question I would pose.
I think that's great. Did you read this quote, the one from St. Francis de Sales you have in here? I just thought it was so good when you're examining the doctrine of indefectibility.
So St. Francis de Sales, again, in the Catholic controversy, and this is a rebuttal against the Protestants, he says, "How, I ask you, should he have abandoned the church, which cost him all his blood, so many toils and travails? He has drawn Israel out of Egypt, out of the desert, out of the Red Sea, out of so many calamities and captivities, and we are to believe that he has let Christianity be engulfed in infidelity. Oh, how utterly vain and good for nothing would be the promises on promises which he has made in the perpetuity of this church. And I have another short citation from him further down, because these groups all claim that the church is teaching error, but St. Francis de Sales says, in 1 Timothy 3:15, it describes the church of the living God, the pillar and the bulwark of truth. And St. Francis de Sales says, to be a pillar of truth cannot appertain to an erring and straying church. You can't be a pillar of truth if you're teaching error.
Right.
That's inconsistent. So,
right.
Yeah, that's kind of the main premise there is, I think the state of necessity has to be objectively verified. I think supply jurisdiction has to be explained a little better than we're going to deliberately deceive people. And you have to reconcile these things with indefectibility, because if the church has not defected, as we know she can't, then there's no justification for ministering against her. Right. These things don't line up. So I'll conclude with this is again a bit of a longer citation, but this is at the very end of my paper here. This is from United States Catholic Magazine from 1844. So this is from quite some time ago. And this addresses, all the way back then, this addresses the issue of the state of necessity. This is not something new to the church. The church has addressed this before. So this is again, United States Catholic Magazine, 1844. It says, the Protestants maintain that a stern necessity occasioned by the wretched and corrupt state of the Roman Church at the time of the Reformation obliged them to set up a new ministry. This too was the plea alleged by the Arians, the Manichaeans, and other sectarians of ancient times in support of their attempt to remodel the church. Can it be said, will it be said, that all these were in the right? Assuredly not, yet they did at one time merely what the Reformers did some centuries later. They proceeded in the same way and gave the same proofs of their mission, that is to say, their own assertion, their bold invectives, and a presumptuous declaration that they were more enlightened and understanding the doctrines of Christianity better than the Christian church itself. And then, to pay attention here, it says, necessity of setting up a new ministry, but where is it written in the authentic records of divine revelation that necessity can found a divine mission? We read in the scripture, neither doth any man take the honor to himself, but he that is called by God, as Aaron was. Where do we read, neither doth any man take the honor to himself, but he that is called to it by necessity? We learn also from St. Paul that no one can preach unless he be sent. But where is it said, except in the case of necessity? Necessity, therefore, is in this case an unmeaning word. What becomes in this supposition of our Lord's unconditional promises, according to which the gates of hell shall never prevail against it, and he himself will be with its pastors all days, even to the consummation of the world? This is almost 200 years ago the church has addressed this claim, and it didn't hold up back then. So it doesn't seem like a very solid argument.
Oh yeah, I mean, they totally called their number. You can't really add anything to that. That was an awesome quote from that article. Yeah. It just shows that there's nothing new under the sun. The church has seen all this before, and she's called it what it is. So just because, this group is running around with a different name, or, maybe, they're pointing to different things that didn't exist 200 years ago because, the Second Vatican Council hadn't happened yet or whatever. It's like, yeah, but it's all the same trend. Every heretic does the same thing, and they remove authority from the church and place it on themselves. It's like the same basic pattern, even with different terms or a different subject,
Yeah. Yep. It's always the same stuff. As the saying goes, nothing new under the sun. The church has seen all these things before. These things are very thoroughly refuted. I wonder if we can include Mr. Eric Hoyle's works in the show notes, because he has some very, very in-depth and thorough research into the apostolicity of the church and mission and jurisdiction. And I mean, it's incredibly thorough, and I think it's well worth the read. It's very long, but for people who want to understand why it is that it's so important for bishops to have jurisdiction and have authority, why it's so important to be sent by the church. You can't take the mission of the church onto yourself. You must be authorized and delegated by the church. And all these things are so important, and we need to understand that, setting up a mission in opposition to the church, setting up a mission that supplants the ordinary mission of the church, setting up a mission that, you claim to be sent by God, but we have no proof of that. Again, very old. I mean, St. Francis de Sales was addressing these things 500 years ago. I really think, and I remember the first time I heard about this idea of mission and ordinary and extraordinary mission, I'd never heard about these things before. And then I looked into it and I read Francis de Sales. I read all these quotes and I said, well, this is very clearly a very old traditional teaching of the church. The church has a very clear stance on this. And this very clearly, very thoroughly answers all of these propositions that are put forth by these groups like the SSPX.
Right.
So I would really encourage people to read those. I'll read one last quote here from Dom Prosper Garanger. I probably butchered that French, but this is from 1909. He says, "We then, both priests and people, have a right to know whence our pastors have received their power. From whose hand have they received the keys? If their mission comes to us from the apostolic see, let us honor and obey them, for they are sent to us by Jesus Christ, who has invested them through Peter with his own authority. If they claim our obedience without having been sent by the Bishop of Rome, we must refuse to receive them, for they are not acknowledged by Christ as his ministers. The holy anointing may have conferred on them the sacred character of the episcopate. It matters not, they must be as aliens to us, for they have not been sent. They are not pastors." Again, that's from 1909. These things are very old. These things are very entrenched in the traditional teaching of the church. Seriously, look into these things. The idea of mission and jurisdiction, they're very closely tied with each other, and they're very important for us to understand. Because if you ask the question, who sent you, and it's not the church, then there's a problem.
Right. No, that's Pius XII has some great stuff that's very pertinent to this. I mean, I was just flipping through Mystici Corporis, and in like 64 and 65, I mean, this is so pertinent to what you're saying too. He says, how grievously they err who arbitrarily claim that the church is something hidden and invisible, as they also do who look upon her as a mere human institution, possessing a certain disciplinary code and external ritual, but lacking power to communicate supernatural life. On the contrary, as Christ, head and exemplar of the church, is not complete if only his visible human nature is considered, or if only his divine invisible nature, but he is one through the union of both and one in both. So it is with his mystical body, since the word of God took unto himself a human nature liable to sufferings, so that he might consecrate in his blood the visible society founded by him, and lead man back to things invisible under a visible rule. And that was just 64. And then the next one's a little bit longer, but probably worth reading too, just because, again, it's like all this talk about supply jurisdiction in the case of necessity as determined by the individual because of an apparent crisis. They're putting on these, they're identifying marks that the church has not laid out. The Pontifical Council that you read at the very beginning of the video, that quote saying that you must have objective criteria to judge that a state of emergency exists. And that must be determined by the church, not by some individual, not by some group, because otherwise you're operating like just these invisible things can suddenly justify you basically operating the church by yourself or creating this parallel church. And it's totally contrary to the magisterium and tradition. And so 65 in Mystici Corporis continues, "For this reason, we deplore and condemn the pernicious error of those who dream of an imaginary church, a kind of society that finds its origin and growth in charity, to which somewhat contemptuously they oppose another, which they call juridical. But this distinction which they introduce is false. For they fail to understand that the reason which led our divine Redeemer to give to the community of man he founded the constitution of a society perfect of its kind, and containing all the juridical and social elements, namely that he might perpetuate on earth the saving work of redemption, was also the reason why he willed it to be enriched with the heavenly gifts of the Paraclete. The Father indeed willed it to be the kingdom of the Son of his predilection, but it was to be a real kingdom in which all believers should make him the entire offering of their intellect and will, and humbly and obediently model themselves on him who for our sake was made obedient unto death." Another thing there, obedience, and how the recognize and resist dogma says that, tries to justify obedience for so many reasons. It's like, where is that in tradition? So it continues. Right. There can then be no real opposition or conflict between the invisible mission of the Holy Spirit and the juridical commission of ruler and teacher received from Christ, since they mutually complement and perfect each other, as do the body and soul in man, and proceed from our one Redeemer, who not only said, as he breathed on the apostles, "Receive ye the Holy Spirit," but also clearly commanded, "As the Father hath sent me, I also send you. And again, he that heareth you heareth me." And that's... Yep. Oh my gosh, yeah, go read that encyclical. It's so pertinent. It's everywhere. Yeah. If you have the eyes to see it, you can't miss this stuff.
Right. Right. Like you said, Luke 10:16, he who hears you hears me. He who rejects you rejects me. If you reject the authority of every bishop in the entire world, which it must be said, that's what they do. They don't believe that there is any lawful bishop in the world to which they are subject. I mean, all recent controversies aside, apparently they didn't even think Bishop Strickland was orthodox enough because they still had a chapel in his diocese without his permission. I mean, what is the criteria that you impart on somebody to say, okay, no, you are good enough, you are orthodox enough, we can't operate in your territory? They don't subject themselves, they don't submit to any lawful authority, any lawful bishop anywhere, even when the bishops tell them to leave. So, right, he who rejects you rejects me. I mean, these things are very clear. These things are very old. I mean, they're biblical. I mean, I've got one last one here. Romans 13, 1-2. It says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment."
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for all your work compiling those and putting out this argument, thinking it through, and just asking the questions, because hopefully it will get people thinking and talking to their friends and family who are, who have never been presented with these ideas before in these words, especially people who've never been exposed to anything but the teaching of the society or Sedevacantists, who of course are always justifying their position. But like you're showing, their justifications aren't even logical, and they're definitely not Catholic.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for giving me the opportunity to present this and to maybe get it into some people's, get it running through some people's heads that, you don't have to be a canon lawyer or a theologian or anything like that to look through these things. I mean, like I said at the beginning, I just took this through a simple logic exercise and just tried to see how it would shake out, how the dominoes would fall, and it doesn't seem to work. So I don't think we need to try to be figuring out how one canon fits into another or how one justifies another or anything like this. I think we just look at it logically. I think we just look at it objectively. And again, as I stated multiple times for people watching, if you have answers to these questions, please let me know, because I've not been able to figure it out and there doesn't seem to be a clear answer. And I think if there isn't a clear answer, I'd be very hesitant about aligning myself with that kind of stance. I'd be because, as Father Anglais says, if there is no jurisdiction, if there is no authority, then the work is illegitimate and therefore evil. I mean, he said that. Again, I'm quoting him. I'm not saying that myself. So This is a really big deal. These are not things to be taken lightly. If you have answers to these questions that I've posed, I mean, read the article. There's a lot more detail that, we didn't go over every single thing, but if you have answers to these questions, please let me know. But it doesn't seem that there's a good answer. So this question may just go unresolved, but I do hope we get some feedback or some kind of response to this, because I think these are definitely questions worth asking. And it's things that people should be asking themselves about this ministry, because it's so irregular. It's so, they've spent so much time and effort trying to justify, trying to defend their position. It's just, then you're putting yourself in a position where you have to just, defend yourself left and right. You're backed into a corner all the time. You always have to figure your way out. And it's like, it's so much easier to just accept the authority, accept the judgment, and submit to the magisterium. Otherwise, it's completely subjective. Otherwise, it's completely up to you and up to each individual person. And that is just not how the church works.
Right. Yeah, there's definitely a sense in which it's easier, or shall we say simpler, to accept the judgment of the church, but it's definitely very painful for people to do that, because it requires that you have to check your personal judgment at the door. It doesn't mean you turn off your brain, because the church is not ever asking you to do that. Like, you're using your brain in this exercise, and it's leading you back to what the church has already taught. Mm-hmm. So you definitely are not doing that by acquiescing to what the church's decisions are in a certain matter, but you may have to leave some of your preferences some of your opinions or anxieties or your conspiracy theories, like you might have to just say, I'm going to put those on hold for now because I'm doing the most essential thing and aligning myself with the church that God gave me to assure me that I had a way to get to heaven. Like, I know about the church. I want to be Catholic. Like, these people, they call themselves Catholic. We want to be Catholic. The adherents of the society, adherents of Sedevacantism, everybody wants to be Catholic. So if that's really where you're at, like, let's find out where that is, because there's got to be one place. It can't be in all these little spin-off groups. It can't be. And, you know, if you're teaching that the one church that Christ established, that's the bark of Peter, is now an unsafe, you know, resting place. It's not a haven. It's not a refuge. It's now a threat to you. So that sounds like a good way that the devil could be scaring people away from their eternal salvation, because making God's church look like the enemy is going to ensure that you stay far away from it and far away from grace. So it's a great tactic. We got to make sure that we're on the right side of this issue.
Yeah. Yep. It's you know, submission to authority is key. If you are not submitting to authority, you're your own authority, and there's no basis, there's no justification for putting your eternal salvation in the hands of yourself as the ultimate authority. You know, we have a church for a reason. We have a magisterium for a reason. And I think we need to just trust them.
Amen. Thank you, Andrew. It's been really good.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be back on. It was so much fun.
Oh, it is. It's great. It's really good for me too. And I just learned so much from you. So thank you again. And God bless you in your work. Keep writing, because you do a great job. And yes, everybody check it out. If you haven't been to tradrecovery.com, Andrew writes and posts there. And there's a lot of great people, great discussions going on, and resources for you and your family and friends. So thank you again for joining us. God bless you all. And we will see you again.